There is a provision buried deep in the United States tax code, barely understood by most Americans, that allows some of the wealthiest people on the planet to pay a lower tax rate on their income than the teachers who educate their children, the nurses who care for their parents, and the firefighters who protect their homes. This is not a conspiracy theory or an exaggeration. It is documented fact, confirmed by tax records, congressional testimony, and the public statements of billionaires themselves who have admitted that something is fundamentally broken when they pay 15% while their secretaries pay 35%. The provision is called carried interest. And while the name sounds technical and boring, deliberately so perhaps, what it represents is one of the most successful wealth transfer mechanisms ever created, moving billions of dollars each year from the public treasury into the pockets of private equity managers, hedge fund operators, and hairy moguls who have convinced politicians that their compensation deserves special treatment because they are taking risks and creating value, when in reality they are simply manipulating the tax code in ways that ordinary workers could never access, even if they understood how. But to understand how this loophole became so powerful, how it survived decades of reform attempts and public outcry, you have to go back to the 1950s when the modern venture capital and private equity industries were just beginning to emerge. The tax code at that time distinguished between ordinary income, which was taxed at rates that could reach 90% for the highest earners, and capital gains, which were taxed at much lower rates under the theory that encouraging investment was good for economic growth and that people who risked their own money to build businesses deserved preferential treatment compared to those who simply collected salaries. This distinction made sense in a world where the people investing capital were actually putting their own wealth at risk, where entrepreneurs and investors were betting their savings on new ventures and should be rewarded if those bets paid off. But what happened over the following decades was that smart lawyers and accountants figured out how to characterize compensation as capital gains even, when no actual capital was being risked, and the carried interest loophole was born. Here's how it works, and pay close attention, because this is where the magic trick happens when a private equity fund is created. The managers typically contribute only 1 or 2% of the capital, while outside investors, pension funds and endowments, and wealthy individuals contribute the remaining 98 or 99%. The fund then buys companies, often loading them with debt, cuts costs, fires workers, and tries to sell those companies a few years later for a profit. The managers receive two types of compensation: a management fee of around 2% of assets under management each year, which is taxed as ordinary income, and a performance fee of 20% of any profits, which is called carried interest and is taxed as long-term capital gains at rates that until recently were 15% and are now 23.8% for the highest earners after the Affordable Care Act. The crucial point is that the managers are not investing their own money. They are investing other people's money, and yet they are allowed to treat 20% of the profits as if they had put up their own capital and held it for years, even though they risked nothing except their time and their reputation, which is what every worker risks when they show up for their job each day. The defense of this arrangement, repeated endlessly by lobbyists and politicians who receive campaign contributions from the private equity industry, is that fund managers are providing valuable services, that they are creating jobs and growing companies and generating returns for pension funds that support retired teachers and firefighters, and therefore they deserve this preferential tax treatment. But this argument collapses under the slightest scrutiny, because if providing valuable services entitled you to capital gains treatment, then every consultant, every lawyer, every doctor, every software engineer would qualify, and the distinction between labor income and investment income would cease to exist entirely. The reason carried interest is treated as capital gains is not economic logic, but political power. The power of an industry that manages trillions of dollars and can afford to hire armies of lobbyists and make massive campaign contributions to ensure that any attempt to close the loophole dies in committee or gets watered down to meaninglessness, and the amounts involved are staggering. We are not talking about a few $1,000,000 here and there, but billions each year that could be going to fund infrastructure, education, healthcare, or deficit reduction, but instead flows to a tiny group of people who are already among the wealthiest in the country. Studies by the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation have estimated that closing the carried interest loophole would raise somewhere between $15 and $18 billion over 10 years. And while that might sound small compared to the federal budget, it is enough to fund universal preschool or rebuild every bridge rated as structurally deficient, or provide health care to millions of uninsured Americans. More importantly, the existence of the loophole sends a message about whose interests the tax system is designed to serve. And that message is that if you have enough money and enough influence, you can rewrite the rules to benefit yourself while everyone else pays full freight. The history of attempts to close this loophole is a case study in how wealthy interests capture the political system and protect their advantages, even when those advantages are indefensible on policy grounds. In 2007, when Democrats controlled Congress and public anger about inequality was rising, there was a serious push to eliminate carried interest, with bills introduced and hearings held and editorials written supporting the change. The private equity industry mobilized immediately, spending tens of millions on lobbying and campaign contributions. And they had a powerful weapon, which was that many pension funds, including public employee pension funds, invested heavily in private equity and could be convinced that closing the loophole would hurt their returns. Even though basic economics says that tax treatment of the managers has no effect on the gross returns of the fund. The bill died and the loophole survived, and every subsequent attempt has followed the same pattern. Initial momentum, fierce lobbying, manufactured concerns about unintended consequences, and eventual defeat or dilution. Even President Trump, who campaigned in 2016 on closing, carried interest and called it a disgrace that hedge fund managers were getting away with murder on taxes, failed to eliminate it once in office. And the tax bill passed in 2017 left the loophole largely intact with only a minor change. Requiring a 3-year holding period instead of 1 year, President Biden has repeatedly called for eliminating carried interest in his budget proposals, describing it as an unfair tax break that benefits the wealthy at everyone else's expense. But even with Democratic control of Congress in 2021 and 2022, when it seemed like the moment had finally arrived, the provision was stripped out of major legislation at the last minute after Senator Kirsten, who had received substantial campaign contributions from private equity executives, insisted on protecting the loophole as a condition for her vote. This is not democracy. This is plutocracy. This is a system where a small number of wealthy donors can veto policies that have overwhelming public support and clear economic justification simply because they have the resources to make politicians dependent on their contributions. If this makes you angry, if you are starting to see how the game is rigged at the most fundamental level, then you are beginning to understand what most people never realize. And if you want to know who else is benefiting from loopholes you have never heard of, if you want to understand the full architecture of how wealth protects itself through the tax code, then subscribe now, because what comes next will show you that carried interest is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And the complete picture is even more disturbing than you might imagine. But the carried interest loophole is not just about the money. Although the money matters enormously, it is about what this loophole reveals about priorities and values and who has power in the American system. When politicians say there is no money to fund universal health care or free college or infrastructure repair, what they really mean is that there is no political will to make wealthy people pay the same rates as everyone else. Because the money exists, it is there in these loopholes and exemptions and special carve-outs that save the top 1% hundreds of billions each year. The carried interest loophole alone could fund significant programs. But more importantly, the existence of such an obviously unjustifiable provision tells you that the system is designed to protect existing wealth at all costs, even when that comes at the expense of productive investment and economic dynamism. And the effects ripple outward in ways that most people never connect. Because when private equity managers can take home hundreds of millions in a single year while paying lower rates than their assistants, it creates incentives for the best and brightest to go into finance rather than start companies or teach or do scientific research or any of the other things that actually create value rather than just extracting it. The carried interest loophole has helped fuel the financialization of the American economy, the shift away from making things and toward manipulating money, and this has contributed to declining business dynamism, fewer startups, more consolidation, and ultimately slower economic growth for everyone except those at the very top. When you can make more money by loading companies with debt and cutting costs than by building something new, when financial engineering is more lucrative than actual engineering, the economy becomes a casino where the house always wins and ordinary people bear all the risk. The private equity industry will tell you that they create value by making companies more efficient, that they bring discipline and expertise and transform struggling businesses into thriving ones. And sometimes that is true. There are cases where a well-run buyout improves operations and preserves jobs, but more often what happens is that companies are purchased with borrowed money, stripped of assets, forced to cut costs in ways that harm workers and communities, and then either sold to someone else or loaded with so much debt that they eventually collapse. Toys R Us, Payless Shoe Source, Sports Authority, countless regional newspapers and hospital chains. These companies were not killed by Amazon or changing consumer preferences, but by private equity firms that extracted hundreds of millions in fees while loading the companies with unsustainable debt. And when those companies failed, the workers lost their jobs and the communities lost their anchor stores, and the managers walked away with their carried interest taxed at 15%, while the workers got nothing but severance packages and broken promises. And here is what should terrify you about this system. It is not just that it exists, it is that it is almost impossible to change because the people who benefit from it control the levers of power. Every senator has wealthy donors who benefit from carried interest. Every congressman has private equity firms in their district or hedge funds that employ their constituents. And more insidiously, the revolving door between government and finance means that the people writing tax policy often come from the industry or plan to go into the industry after their government service ends. And you cannot expect someone to write rules that harm their future employers or their former colleagues. This is regulatory capture in its purest form, where the industry being regulated essentially controls the regulators, and it extends beyond carried interest to every corner of the tax code. From opportunity zones to like-kind exchanges to step-up basis to corporate tax havens, each representing another way that wealth protects itself from taxation while ordinary income earners having no escape. The philosophical argument for progressive taxation, the idea that those who benefit most from society should contribute the most to maintaining it, has been completely inverted through loopholes like carried interest. Instead of the wealthy paying higher rates, they pay lower rates. And they do this not through illegal tax evasion, but through perfectly legal tax avoidance that has been written into law by politicians they helped elect. Warren Buffett famously pointed out that he pays a lower rate than his secretary. And he said this was wrong, that it represented a failure of tax policy. But despite his advocacy and despite similar statements from other billionaires who recognize the nothing has changed because the incentives are all wrong and the political system is broken. The people with the power to change the system are the people who benefit from keeping it exactly as it is. And the people who suffer from the system, the teachers and nurses and construction workers who pay full freight, do not have the resources to compete with private equity lobbyists and hedge fund donations. What would happen if carried interest were eliminated tomorrow, if the 20% performance fee were taxed as ordinary income the way every other form of compensation is taxed? The private equity industry claims it would be devastating, that funds would close, that investment would dry up, that pension funds would lose their best source of returns. But this is nonsense. The evidence from other countries that do not have carried interest, loopholes, shows that private equity functions just fine when managers pay normal tax rates. What would change is that managers would take home less money after taxes, but the gross returns to investors would be unchanged, and if anything, the industry might become less focused on short-term financial engineering and more focused on long-term value creation if the tax advantage of the current structure were removed. But we will never find out because the industry will fight with everything it has to preserve this loophole. And given their track record of success, betting on reform would be foolish. So what can you do sitting there, watching this unfold, knowing that the system is rigged but feeling powerless to change it? Because individual action seems meaningless when the problem is structural and political. The honest answer is that fixing carried interest requires political change. It requires electing representatives who are not dependent on private equity money and who will prioritize fairness over campaign contributions. And that is difficult, but not impossible. But even before that happens, you can refuse to accept the justifications and the excuses. You can stop believing that people who earn hundreds of millions deserve special tax treatment because they are job creators or risk takers. When they are doing neither, you can educate yourself and others about how the system actually works rather than how we are told it works. And you can support organizations and candidates who are genuinely committed to reform, even when that means going against powerful interests. The carried interest loophole exists not because it is good policy, but because wealthy people want it to exist and have the power to make it so. And that should make you question every other piece of the tax code that seems designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The deeper issue here is not just carried interests, but the broader question of whether democracy can survive when economic inequality reaches levels where a small number of people control enough wealth to essentially purchase political outcomes. The carried interest loophole is a symptom of a larger disease, which is the corruption of the political system by concentrated wealth. And that disease is terminal if left untreated because it creates a feedback loop where wealth generates political power, which generates rules that protect and enhance wealth, which generates more political power. And at some point, the system becomes so tilted that reform is impossible without a crisis or a revolution. We may be approaching that point now, as anger about inequality and unfairness reaches levels not seen since the Great Depression, but whether that anger translates into meaningful change or is channeled into scapegoating and division depends on whether people understand who is actually benefiting from the system and why. Do you still believe that the tax system is fundamentally fair, that everyone pays their share, that the rules apply equally to rich and poor? Or are you starting to see that fairness is a myth, that the system is designed by and for people who already have wealth, and that everyone else is just playing a game where the rules were written to ensure they lose? These are uncomfortable questions that most people prefer not to think about because the answers are depressing and the solutions seem impossible, but ignoring them does not make the problem go away. It just ensures that the gap between rhetoric and reality, between what we are told about America and how America actually works, continues to widen until eventually something breaks. If this has opened your eyes, if you understand now that the carried interest loophole is not an accident or an oversight, but a deliberate choice to prioritize the interests of the wealthy over everyone else, then you need to see what we are revealing next, because the tax code contains dozens of similar provisions, each one designed to benefit a specific group of wealthy people, each one defended by armies of lobbyists, each one surviving year after year despite being indefensible on policy grounds. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself. Because once you start seeing how the game is really played, once you understand that the rules are written by the winners to ensure they keep winning, you can never go back to believing the comfortable myths that keep most people compliant and powerless. And that knowledge is both liberating and terrifying because it means you have a choice. You can accept the system as it is, or you can fight to change it. But you can no longer pretend that it is fair or that everyone is playing by the same rules.